I want to bring on someone I've gotten to know virtually over the next few months. Todd Wolfson is joining us. He is an associate professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University and president of the Rutgers Union of Graduate Workers, Faculty, and Postdoctoral Associates. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul and Jen. Never fun to follow Zizek in an interview.
Yeah, you know. I should have just said that now for something completely different, but very important. So you just got done attending, and I think you helped put together this Higher Education Labor Summit. So could you just talk a little bit about that? Like, what was the impetus for putting this together? What kind of came out of it? Tell us about it.
Absolutely. So it was last week on Wednesday and Friday, and it's the Higher Ed Labor Summit, Building a Movement to Transform Higher Ed. And basically, it's important to note the context. Higher ed is in both a acute and long-term crisis. The long-term crisis has been massive disinvestment from federal and state government, and that's led to public universities in particular reaching in all sorts of ways, moving towards, as we all know, a neoliberal or corporate form of governance of our higher ed institutions, which has led to rising tuition costs and growing student debt, but also a growing number of contingent workers in higher ed, including adjuncts, and that's one of the segments of the labor force we see the most as the most exploited. But we also are talking about staff. So that's been a crisis in higher ed over the last 50 years. And then with the pandemic, we've seen an acute crisis. Higher ed was hit particularly hard by the pandemic. 650,000 people in the US lost their jobs, and that's about 13% of the sector. So in general, higher ed has seen these two crises. But we've also, those of us in labor have also seen a moment where there's a lot of hand-wringing and discussion at the federal level about what's to be done in higher ed. Competing bills, one the American Families Plan, and another from Senator Sanders and Rep. Jayapal, which is called College for All. And so we recognize this as a moment to step into the space and build a collective voice to fight for the future of higher ed. And the only way we're going to transform higher ed is if labor leads the way. And so we had this summit last week. It was 2 days. We had hundreds of participants from 75 different unions, representing over between 300,000 and 400,000 workers. We came out with a platform to focus us on next steps and how to build power together. So that's what it was about, and I can say more about what the platform is, et cetera.
Yeah, the platform, but also maybe first, I mean, what kind of interested me about this is you united. It wasn't just like faculty and grad students, right. All types of workers, including blue collar workers that work on the campus. So maybe could you talk about how did you bring those forces together, and then about the platform you hammered out?
Yeah, and I would say I think this is new. There have been moments when unions, but largely faculty unions, have aligned themselves around the future of higher ed. I think there have been moments when adjunct faculty have aligned themselves, a new faculty majority and others. So since the pandemic, I've been president of Rutgers faculty, grad, postdoc union, and we've had an ongoing fight with the Rutgers administration. And what we did in order to respond to that was we pivoted away from a local specific fight with the university towards an industrial model of organizing, right? So we brought in 20 unions that represent 20,000 workers, and we aligned ourselves towards a single strategy to fight back, and we won. And so it got us thinking about how that could work at a national level. And so the summit itself was a mixture of all sorts of workers, grad workers, tenure track faculty, adjunct faculty, administrative staff, groundskeepers, healthcare workers, because we know many of our public universities are also massive medical industrial complexes. And so it was across the spectrum. And I think our analysis is, if we're going to reform higher ed, it can't be one part of the labor force within the industry leading the way. It needs to be a collective, united front. So that's what we built out, and we're starting to build out. So for instance, some of the conveners were one of the major conveners was AFSCME 3299, which has, I think, about 30,000 administrative staff and all sorts of staff in the UC system in California. Another was Union of Rutgers Administrators, which is administrative staff. We had unions from medical parts of universities like Rutgers and others, the SUNY system. So it's a broad base that we're trying to build and we think that's the only way we can actually win this fight.
Yeah, and that definitely is appealing to me. And I hope this doesn't sound bad, because sometimes when, there's higher ed labor fights of grad students or not, it does seem kind of like isolated and, not necessarily of the utmost importance. But I think, when you think about it, like take Philadelphia, universities are a huge part of our economy. And of course, it's not just the professors. I remember when I was at Temple, dining hall workers were in a union, the groundskeeping staff. So it really is a big force that can be brought together, and it is important for the economy.
It's critical to the economy, right? And also when you think about something like the pandemic and you think about how the managers of our public institutions act, we know what they've done historically, and we know what they did here, which is they always went after the most vulnerable workers. So they went after adjunct faculty, they went after staff, and largely disproportionately low-wage workers, largely disproportionately women and people of color. That happened at Rutgers. It happened across the nation in the layoffs. And so, and then also when we think about students, the people who are most burdened by student debt because of the rising tuition costs are largely working class kids. And so if we want to reimagine higher ed and also fight student debt, the way we're going to do it is to build a broad-based force with staff and adjunct faculty leading the way. And that's what we're trying to build out now. And so I'll just say to you, Paul, to your point, as the president, I'm vice president of my union, but as the president of a faculty union, what I stepped into was a place where faculty really feel like special unicorns, right? That they're different, that they're not workers. And what we have to do is change that way of thinking and build a sort of ideological and political force that recognizes us all as workers that make our institutions run, whether we're serving food at the dining halls, whether we're teaching in a class, whether we're working on the grounds, whether we're security guards, et cetera. And so that's what we're trying to do, and that's the goal here.
Awesome. So do you want to talk about what are some of the highlights of the platform that you all discussed and decided on?
Yeah, I think the highlight here is fighting against, what we're trying to do actually first and foremost is to build an aligned social force that can continue to fight in the medium term over a set of these issues. And the reality is it hasn't existed in higher ed. There has not been an alignment of forces. And part of this is because of the way we're represented. We're all represented by unions that have another workforce that's dominant, whether it's K-12 for AFT, whether it's municipal workers for AFSCME, whether it's industrial workers for UAW. And so what we've recognized is if we're going to actually make a play here, we need to build alignment amongst all the local unions together and step forward there. And so the main goal is to use the fights over higher ed funding right now to build this force that's both around legislative fights, but also ultimately about direct action and building collectivity and building this social force. And we've been watching our siblings in K-12 and been really inspired by the leadership, the Red for Ed movement, but also the work of unions like CTU or UTLA. And so I think for us, we want to build this engine, but in the short term, what we're doing is focusing on these federal bills. So there's the Biden-backed plan, the American Families Plan, which calls for free college education for community colleges, for two-year institutions. And then there's the Sanders-Jayapal bill, which calls for free public higher ed for 2- and 4-year institutions, and then also has these two critical labor provisions. One, that all universities, public universities that get this funding are bound to move all instruction towards a model of 75% tenure stream and 25% adjunct or part-time faculty. Right now at universities like Rutgers, it's the opposite. 70% is adjunct faculty or grad workers, and 30% is tenure stream. And they also have a corollary provision that all these institutions like Rutgers, if they're going to get this money, they must move to a 75% tenure stream model, and they must hire first and foremost their own contingent faculty for those new roles. And so the unions at this event very strongly back this plan. And we are going to lift our voices up and demand that whether it's College for All or the American Families Plan, that in it, that there is funding for public universities at 2 and 4-year institutions, and that there is these 2 labor provisions that will create less contingent labor. We also want pay parity for part-time teachers. So whether you end up being a tenure stream faculty member or an adjunct faculty member, we want you paid as much as tenure stream faculty.
That's all awesome stuff. And maybe to go backwards a little bit, I know this might be kind of a big question, but you recently had a fight over what's called Worksharing. And I think our audience might want to know what that is. It probably sounds like a really nice thing to people. Can you talk a little bit about like what is Worksharing and how did you all fight it at Rutgers?
Yeah, so we fought for it. It's complicated. So what Worksharing is, what the university at what Rutgers did was the pandemic hit and they laid off 1,000 workers. Again, dining staff and adjunct faculty, largely low wage, largely women and people of color. We built an alliance of 20 unions, and we turned to the university and said, with the CARES Act, we can build a plan out that saves the university $100 million, which is about what they said their shortfall was because of the pandemic, doesn't cost workers a dime. And if we give you that, we demand that you don't lay anyone off. And what we offered actually was Workshare. And what that means simply, it comes from Europe, and it's a social democratic model. And basically it says that in a time of crisis, the state picks up the cost of the employee, a part of the cost of the employee for the employer. In this case, Rutgers. They share the cost. The employee is furloughed, but the employee doesn't lose that money because the state picks it up through unemployment. So with the CARES Act and then with the later pandemic relief bills, there is unemployment. And through that unemployment from the federal government, we're able to keep everyone whole while furloughing, which saves Rutgers money. And so we offered that to the university. Ultimately, we forced them to accept it. We saved the university $100,000. We got all our staff rehired, and we got all our adjuncts rehired. We'll see, but we expect them all to be rehired in September. We also won important things for our grad workers and others. So it was something we actually fought for in order to lead in a moment when we knew the university was going to take the most irresponsible approach, which is lay off low-wage workers, et cetera. So we got them all hired back through the Workshare program.
Thanks for correcting. I don't know why I was thinking that you all were against it. And then, it feels like so many things in society, it's like before COVID and after COVID, where, we kind of have this sense, even though we don't know fully what's going to look like, that things are kind of changed forever after COVID. How do you think that's playing out in the university? And I know you were already saying that, of course, for years, like universities are becoming more neoliberal in different ways. This has already been a trend, but do you see anything kind of being accelerated post-COVID?
Absolutely. So we're in these fights at Rutgers, and you think about Naomi Klein's work, Shock Doctrine, right? And the argument that they will never let a good crisis go to waste. So we had deans and administrators saying, literally, we must use this crisis to create a more efficient workforce. What that meant to them was disciplining faculty, disciplining staff, and getting rid of redundancies. And so we expected them, and they did attempt to take every nasty managerial strategy to speed up the workforce and to get rid of redundancies that they could. And they used the pandemic to do that. And so there's no reason to expect that they are going to stop with that strategy, whether we're talking about Rutgers, whether we're talking about Temple University or Penn State or the UC system or SUNY, right? And so that's the fight in front of us, is a series of neoliberal managers who run our institutions and their attempts to speed up the workforce. And so this brings me to the last goal that we have at Rutgers, and I think we need to have across the university, across the nation, which is in our public institutions, in our public universities, we must fight for workers' councils that govern these institutions, because we know that the people governing these institutions and running them now do not do it in the interest of the students, the parents, or the workers who make these universities run, or the states in which they're embedded. And so the only people that can reimagine higher ed, public higher ed in particular, that speaks to the states and the parents and the students and the workers, is the workers and the students together. And so on the medium-term horizon, we will fight over who governs our institutions.
Very well said. And the last question, I hate to respond to what you just said was something so trivial, but the chat is exploding about the ducks in the background. I don't know if you have any final words about the ducks.
Well, we all need to collectivize ourselves. And as you can see behind me, the ducks have collectivized themselves here, and they are demanding a more just situation. I'm on the Jersey Shore. And so they're demanding a very different situation for ducks down here. No more hunting.
Wow. Radical. Well, thank you so much, Todd, for coming on. I mean, you're really doing great work, really kind of pioneering work in the labor movement in higher education. So thank you so much. I'm sure I'll see you in like a Zoom meeting probably next month or something. But thanks so much for coming on.